Okay, so I just would like to welcome everybody on behalf of the Chamber. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on Facing and Embracing Crisis to Protect Your Brand, sponsored by Princeton Strategic Communications. My name is Meredith Laura Lear, and I'm Executive Vice President of the Chamber. I would like to thank all of you for joining us today, and especially thank our friends from Princeton Strategic Communications, Norris Clark, Managing Partner, David Klusik, Executive Communications Director, and Rick Alcantara, Executive Communications Director. Before I turn the program over to our speakers, please allow me to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, you will see a chat feature. Following the presentations, we will be taking questions from the audience, so please feel free to submit those questions in the chat feature when they come to you. You don't have to wait until the end. You can just submit them in the chat. If we don't get to all of the questions, our speakers will be following up with you, so please know that we will circle back with you. And in an effort to help us do that, if you can make sure that your full name is available on your named video, that would be very helpful. We also will be recording today's presentation, so we will be sending it out following the event today. So if you missed anything, you'll be able to go back and take a look at that. We also will be sharing the presentation with you. So keep an eye out for that email today. It'll also include a survey, and we would really appreciate your feedback on the program. And we will also include contact information for our speakers. So if you are interested in following up with them with any additional questions, you can do so. With that, please join me in welcoming Norris, David, and Rick for the presentation.
Thank you, Meredith. And it's going to be my job to look at that little green dot and try to imagine that you're on the other side of it rather than look over there where I can actually see a lot of you. So my name's Norris Clark. We're part of the Princeton Public Affairs Group. We serve over 200 clients. There are about 50 professionals that we work with. And today we have our crisis team. We're a team that has been through a number of crises. And by the way, I'm South Jersey born and raised, Cherry Hill, Collingswood. I now live in Cape May and spent a little time in Philadelphia. And so we're all South Jersey guys. And Rick he taught at Rowan, public relations. And I guess I asked him what crisis he was unprepared for in his career. He said there was a bombing at the World Trade Center that caused a fire that he was totally unprepared for. And David Klusik has been handling crisis communications for a global chemical company. And David, what was the crisis that you were most unprepared for?
It was a social media attack which had no basis in fact, but still galloped to the millions of impressions.
And one of my first marketing responsibilities was handling Morey's Piers down in the Wildwoods. And a huge fire broke out at one of the rides. And I was not quite prepared to do exactly what I should do. And wished at the time that I had a good crisis communications plan in place. And together we've been in front of a lot of major outlets in the context of a crisis. We've dealt with fires, bank closures, all kinds of scandals, public officials. I was thrust in front of a national press conference for a presidential candidate who was very controversial. And so coronavirus, we've just been through that with a number of our clients. So we've been around the block on a number of crises. And we want you to know that the first key thing that we recommend is to embrace crisis. Now, I know many people would rather have brain surgery without anesthesia than actually think about all the things that could go wrong. But we recommend that you accept the fact that crisis is part of life. If you haven't had a crisis, you're about to. If you haven't had a crisis, you haven't been in business very long. And crisis is not only a part of life, but it's a part of every story that we remember about life. Every movie, every memory, every story that we come in contact with has a crisis. You don't have a story without a crisis. A lot of people that we counsel, they will say things like, why does the media always focus on, the bad things? Why does the media focus on the challenges and the problems? And the answer is because they're looking for a good story. And a story is at the center, or excuse me, a crisis is at the center of all good stories. And if you think about it, all of us are either in the middle of a crisis, dealing with it, or the rest of us are sitting around watching the other half of us dealing with the crisis. That's what happens on the evening news. That's what's happening when we listen to stories from our neighborhood. We are all either dealing with the crisis or we're watching someone else deal with it. And of course, the currency in crisis that's most important is having trust. If you're going to communicate with people in the context of a crisis, trust is by far the most important factor that needs to be preserved. Everything that we do in a crisis is focused on keeping trust alive. Now, we're going to give you just an overview of the many types of crisis, and I'm going to turn it over to Rick, and he'll give us the landscape of crisis.
As Norris mentioned, crisis can happen really to any company. Could be a big company, could be a small company. In fact, the smaller companies sometimes are more vulnerable than even the bigger companies because they probably don't have preparation in place to deal with it. If you think about it, a crisis really could happen at any time. It could come in multiple forms. We certainly haven't listed them all here, but certainly, criminal acts, misconduct, terrorism, a data breach, harassment, a bomb threat, all of these things could affect your business. You could have a legal or a regulatory issue, or you have a lawsuit or a regulatory change. A natural disaster. Here in New Jersey, we had Hurricane Sandy a few years ago. So that disrupted business for months, and for some businesses for years, or some even put them out of business. So a hurricane, a blizzard, tornado. You could have an internal issue, an HR issue, specifically a loss of a senior leader could really impact your organization, especially if you're a publicly traded company. Could be a reputation issue. As David mentioned earlier, a social media crisis could pop up at any time. It doesn't have to be based in fact, it just has to be out there and you're going to have to deal with it. A facilities issue, whether there's a fire or whether there's a contamination, computer issue. And then there could be issues that don't even involve your company, but because you're in the same industry sector, you will be pulled into it and the media might even drag you in. So you have to really start to think about all of those things that could possibly go wrong with your business and what's the likelihood that they could happen to you, and start planning for them.
So Norris mentioned just a moment ago how the crisis really makes the story. Why? Because it's unusual, it's newsworthy, and readers, viewers will be interested to find out more. But when you're preparing for a crisis or when you're in one, it's really important that you put yourself in the reporter's shoes. What would the reporter ask that would make that story, and how will you explain succinctly what happened? Remember that the reporter has an incredible amount of pressure, typically. He or she might be not just under a deadline, but also have to write for a print edition, an online edition, take the photo, take the video, post it to social media. And once they do that, they have to do it several more times a day with several different stories. And by the time that reporter gets home, perhaps pretty late tonight, they won't have any clue about what they wrote. So it's important for you to help them with their job. Help them do their job by providing accurate, truthful information. They know that it's from your perspective, so that's okay. You don't have to try to be a third-party observer, but you do have to be able to think like a journalist so that you can shape your message and shape your information so that it's quickly usable, as well as portraying and conveying the key information that not just the journalist, but the journalist's audience will want to understand. Remember that also that local journalists can very much set the tone for much broader coverage. if your story is something that could jump from the local news outlets to something that's more regional or even national, when the national press comes to visit, they'll be taking their cues from the local journalists who might know you best, or at least know the area, know your customer base, and know something about the area where you work. So pay attention to the local journalist. Don't just think that you're waiting for network news crews to come down with their helicopters. Probably not. It'll start perhaps much smaller than that, and the first steps are really crucial. The first steps have to be quick as well. So remember the timeliness, remember that every reporter's got a deadline that's not just tomorrow. The news cycle today is continuous, so the deadlines are continuous as soon as you can. I know we used to think in some circles that if you get a statement out within an hour, boy, that was really great. Today, well, if you're an hour behind, you might be losing the battle before you even start. You might even find out about your crisis from social media, or find out about it when the reporter calls. Imagine that. Not a comfortable situation to be in, but if you can at least be prepared to move quickly when that situation arises, you'll have a fighting chance to get your message across.
And David, of course, you can't really hide from the media because they're going to get a story with you or without you. So they
Absolutely.
could turn to your competitors, they could turn to disgruntled employees, they could turn to, you know, folks in the community. So you need to be willing to have a comment, you need to be prepared. So the ideal behind having a crisis plan is to have it so that you can be ready to react much faster instead of trying to react, you know, in real time without any preparation.
Yeah, good point, Rick. You want to be in the story, and you want the reporter to come back to you for reliable information, perhaps later in the crisis. They won't let the news hole go empty. They will fill the vacuum, and if you don't help them fill it, someone else will.
So now we're going to give you some examples of getting it wrong. Big companies getting it wrong. And check this out.
Companies get into problems all the time. In recent years, we've had BP, we've had United Airlines, we've had Toyota. And in each case, the companies made it worse for themselves.
I'm physician, have to work tomorrow 8 o'clock, so am I. Yeah. You can talk to them. They want to remove it from now.
The problem with United was the apology. The chief executive in a written statement said that he was sorry for having to re-accommodate a passenger. Now, that was inauthentic. No one uses the word re-accommodate in real life. It had clearly been lawyered. What they should have done is speak like a human being, recognize that they'd done something really bad to a customer and be truly, genuinely sorry for what had happened. The Toyota crisis is in fact really simple. They're known for making great cars, and they failed. So the problem here is that they didn't believe they'd done anything wrong. When you're in an echo chamber where you believe you're brilliant, it's hard to realize that you've actually made mistakes. Lesson here, listen to outsiders. In that world, they are the only people who can give you perspective to address a crisis properly. The problem with BP is that they couldn't extract oil safely, but they compounded it immediately with very bad handling. The now infamous comment by the chief executive that he wanted his life back came to define the crisis and ultimately cost the chief executive his job.
There's no one who wants this thing over more than I do. You know, I'd like my life back.
The lesson? Be disciplined. The media are on alert to find slip-ups like that.
So we also want to give you some examples of getting it right. and one of the hardest things to do, especially for many chief executive officers, is to apologize. Some CEOs may think that apology is showing weakness, but the truth is, if you're genuine in your apology, then that is one of the strongest things you could ever do. It's really only the inauthentic, fake apologies that show weakness. So we recommend in some crises that it's necessary when we have made a mistake to own up to it by apologizing. Let's take a look at what Starbucks, how they handled a crisis they had to deal with.
Protests and calls for a boycott. Now the CEO of Starbucks says he promises to fix all of this. We learned just a few minutes ago, actually, that the Starbucks manager who called the police because 2 African-American men had not placed an order is no longer working at that store. This comes just after the men who were arrested agreed to meet with the company's CEO. Joining me right now with the very latest and how we all got here is CNN's senior national correspondent Alex Marquardt. So, Alex, what is happening with this? People are furious.
People are furious. This story isn't going away, and that's because a lot of people don't want it to go away. So what we've seen today is a large protest. In fact, at that shop, it's in Rittenhouse Square in Philadelphia. Around 100 people showed up.
Oh, it's
chanting.
right there in Rittenhouse. Wow. Okay.
Yep. And they saw this apology from the Starbucks CEO, Kevin Johnson, but they wanted to show up anyway just to draw attention to it and make sure that this story does not go away. But for his part, the CEO, Kevin Johnson, has been apologizing profusely. He appeared on morning TV. He put out a video statement on their Facebook page. He put out a written statement. He called this incident absolutely reprehensible. He says, "This is not who we are, and it's not who we're going to be." Take a listen.
That in certain circumstances, local practices are implemented. In this particular case, the local practice of asking someone who is not a customer to leave the store, and unfortunately then followed by a call to the police. Now, certainly there are some situations where the call to police is justified, situations where there's violence or threats or disruption. In this case, none of that existed. These 2 gentlemen did not deserve what happened, and we are accountable. I am accountable.
Well.
Right, so he's taking responsibility there. He also
I want to give you one more example, getting it right and apologizing. This is the Whole Foods CEOs. We're showing this one to you because it's real and it's real direct. Take a look.
Now to a surprising and very public corporate apology. The heads of a popular high-end supermarket chain, Whole Foods, coming out and saying they are sorry. The company was accused of overcharging customers for prepackaged food, sometimes as much as $15. Here's ABC's Rebecca Jarvis.
This morning, a rare mea culpa. The CEOs of one of the largest grocery store chains in the country speaking directly to consumers, apologizing.
Straight up, we made some mistakes. We want to own that.
Responding to that Consumer Affairs investigation, which accused 8 Whole Foods locations in New York of repeatedly overcharging customers for prepackaged foods, mislabeling weights, resulting in errors like these. A package of chicken tenders, $5 more than it should be. This vegetable platter, $6 more. The CEOs calling the errors completely unintentional.
And we know they're unintentional because the mistakes are both in the customer's favor and sometimes not in the customer's favor.
It isn't the first time grocery stores have been accused of overcharging. GMA Investigates recently followed an undercover inspector on multiple unannounced grocery stores.
Okay, so we want to give you a case study quickly from Southwest Airlines, which really shows what happens when a communications team has a great plan in place, a plan for something they know it's going to happen, and then they execute that plan to perfection for the sake of their customers. Dave?
Those of us in the Philadelphia, South Jersey area can remember this incident just 2 years ago, almost exactly, just a little over 2 years ago, where a Southwest flight made an unscheduled stop in Philadelphia after just a horrible event in midair, really at cruising altitude, 30,000 feet. And one passenger was killed after a piece of the jet engine ripped through the fuselage where the victim was seated, and she was almost actually sucked out of the plane. And just a horrible, horrible case. A lot of the aftermath was quickly filmed on cell phones and became quite a story. Besides the event of the accident itself, what's not so well known and remembered is what Southwest did in compensation, if you will. And yes, there were apologies. They were done quickly. They were done very sincerely. They were also quick with the checkbook. And that by itself, of course, is not necessarily enough by itself, but providing $5,000 stipends to each passenger, another $1,000 for a Southwest Airlines voucher. But I would argue here that a lot of the success was because of other personal touches. The CEO wrote individually to each passenger. Each passenger, if they stayed in Philadelphia near the airport until another flight was booked overnight, had a personalized note underneath their hotel room door advising them where they could seek counseling if they needed it. And I think most important, it's not listed here, but before the passengers disembarked from the aircraft, the pilot individually met with every passenger before they got off the plane. Why is this important? It's because not just doing the right thing, but there's Southwest in some ways had an advantage. They had an advantage because they have such a loyal following. They have such a good reputation for customer service that they had a very good foundation to leverage when the worst almost happened. And what they also did is by acting quickly, they nourished that reputation. They were consistent with it. They did what their customers and I think the general public would expect Southwest to do. And I think you could argue that in this case, their reputation was not only fulfilled, but perhaps enhanced because they did so much of the right things very, very quickly, very sincerely, and person to person. You can't beat it. There's nothing like it, and it's very difficult to do at the time. It doesn't necessarily ensure that you won't have litigation. Southwest did, but I'd much rather go into litigation with a sparkling reputation than one that's been soiled.
We want to let you know there's things that you can do. There's things that if you do, you'll get yourself into trouble. We want to tell you that you should avoid doing certain things. We'll call them the sins of commission. And number one, don't chase the story. Don't make the mistake of issuing a response right away that is not really going to carry water or be credible over the long term. It's not about winning the news cycle. It's about winning the whole news story. The second point is, and this is something we feel very strongly about, you don't win through spin. A lot of people look at public relations as the art of spinning. And we think that's a terrible way to practice public relations. You don't win through spin. Instead, you might even put out information right away that's not going to make you look good, but your transparency is going to be giving you credibility throughout the process. And finally, don't shirk your responsibility and blame somebody else. Take responsibility for it. Even if it was something, let's say, caused by a vendor. Let's say the vendor sent some bad food. If you, as the representative for the company, blame the vendor, all you're going to do is make an enemy out of the vendor, and they're going to go to the press and try to defend themselves. So never put the blame on others. Take responsibility for the situation yourself. Then we want you to be prepared by avoiding sins of omission. And to outline those, I'm going to turn it back over to Dave.
Avoiding delay, I mentioned it before, that's probably one of the top priorities, because if you don't take ownership and join in the conversation, it will be taken over by someone else. And if you look for delay because you have to think through the legal implications, the outcome is the same. You've delayed and you've missed taking ownership and someone will take advantage of that situation. Remember that you can only say that you don't have all the answers. That's a completely reasonable response, but we'll find out and we'll get back to reporters when you do have some of those answers. Having said that, you might be surprised at how much information you really do have. You do know if you're responding. You do know what the response consists of. You do know what you're checking. You do know that there's an investigation that you're launching. You do know what a particular facility or policy how it might normally work. So you can use those items to take part of the conversation. Know your decision-making process as well. It's difficult sometimes to determine whether you should have a lot of information and really not just take ownership, but try to take control, or whether you should stay completely out of the story or someplace in between. That's a tough decision in some cases, but you'll need to know that someone has to decide in the organization because you'll have a lot of competing recommendations. So at the end of that conversation, hopefully a short one, someone needs to say, yes, here's what we're going to do. No, we're not going to do that. We don't know this. We don't want to speculate, but you need to have the decision-making process. It will need to have legal, but it cannot be controlled by legal. You'll have to be sure that the engagement with the public is such that it's straightforward, it's timely, and it's truthful, and that will serve all audiences, from the outside audiences to the inside ones, both now and perhaps later on when you're in a court proceeding.
So those of you who remember the BlackBerry days before the iPhone, BlackBerry was the phone of choice, especially for people in the public sector. And they had an outage, and the lawyers were afraid to let anybody admit what was happening. And for almost 3 days went by with no explanation, which was really the beginning of the end of BlackBerry. Another example, national charity that you would all know, running camps, had an accusation coming out on social media of sexual molestation at the camp. Believe it or not, we were on a conference call for 8 hours, because were not prepared for this. 8 hours to get the legal, the CEO, and the operations team to agree to a 3-paragraph statement about how we're going to feel about it. And the impulse of the attorney was to start speaking legal. Our impulse was to say, listen, step one is you put yourself in the victim's shoes and show some empathy. Fortunately, we won out. But what I want you to avoid is having to spend 8 hours getting a 3-paragraph statement ready for such a sensitive issue. So now we're going to give you a broad overview of how to build a crisis communications plan for your organization. And I'm going to turn it over to Rick, and he's going to start with helping you understand how we identify the different crisis scenarios.
And to follow up a little bit on what David and Norris said, legal is going to be involved in any real crisis situation. Their goal is to protect the company, same as you would from a communications perspective. But as David mentioned, it's going to be very crucial that the communications piece is kind of planned, thought about, kind of anticipated ahead of time. That's why you're looking to build a crisis communication plan so that you have a brand after the entire crisis kind of starts to wind down. So the place that you really start, and think about this, a lot of companies, have a marketing plan, you have a business plan, you have an operations plan, but most companies don't have a communications or crisis communications plan. The crisis communication plan really should align with your operations plan so that when something goes wrong, you kind of know what's going to happen, who's going to say what, where you're going to say it, what kind of tone it's going to take, what messages you're going to emphasize. So the place you really start in this whole equation is figuring out, well, what could go wrong? What's going to be unique to my business that could really potentially blow up into a media event? And you don't want to do this just by yourself. You're going to involve a lot of your senior leaders in this. You might have your CFO, your CEO, your HR director, your head of communications. You're going to have a head of operations, perhaps IT. You're going to have all of these folks looking at this and identifying, maybe at first just creating a list of what could go wrong here and what could have a profound impact on our business. So if you'll see this chart that we have in front of you, we're looking at the potential impact. Is it going to be low? Is it going to be medium? Is it going to be high? And what's the likelihood that it could occur? Again, low, medium, or high. Those items that show up with both a high likelihood as well as a high potential for impact on the business are going to show up in that red area. Items with a little less impact are going to show up in the orange area, yellow, and green. So the items in red are things you absolutely have to focus on. The items in orange are things you should be definitely taking a look at. Yellow, you want to still plan for them, and green are ideas that you're going to be kind of just keeping an eye on. After you kind of go through that exercise and you think about, well, what could go wrong here, you need to really start thinking about who are all the people that have a stake in this business. And a lot of companies will think, well, it's just going to be our customers. Well, you have a lot of audiences. You have a lot of people who are dependent upon your business. On the inside, it's going to be your customers. It's going to be your vendors. It's going to be your board of directors. It's going to be investors. They require communications frequently. They were going to require communications in many cases before you start even thinking about delivering messages externally. On the outside, of course, you've got the media. And as David and Norris and I have all talked about, the media are going to be a big part of any kind of event that has an impact on customers, the community, or even the region. Your customers are going to be very crucial to this, and you want to be involved in communicating with them. You might have government regulators. You may have law enforcement if it's a cyber intrusion. And then there are folks who may not even be a customer, but could have an impact on your business. So community leaders could be part of that process as well. So in thinking about building the plan, after you've identified the stakeholders, after you've identified the issues that could affect your company, you really need to put together a team of folks who are going to be on this crisis planning team. They're the ones who are going to start planning what's going to happen. What are we going to be able to tackle? What are we going to address? Who's going to be responsible for what? So that team could be a handful of people. It could be, depending on the size of your company, maybe just, 5 or 6 people. Then in thinking about, after you've got the team, you're going to identify those issues. You're going to start looking at the stakeholders. You're going to start developing, plans for addressing this plan and what's going to be relevant to each stakeholder group, because one message is not going to work for everybody. So your employees need to know things that are probably very different than what the media's needs are. Then you're going to start developing your messages. And one of the things you're going to do when building out your plan is you're actually going to start thinking about what would you say if this situation were to happen. And by doing that and having the messaging in place, you can actually run those ideas by your attorneys, get their buy-in before an event actually were to take place. And then when the event occurs, you kind of fill in the blanks. Those statements, those releases would actually sit in your crisis plan and can be tweaked as needed when the event actually takes place. You start thinking about, well, what are we going to need to put out there? What vehicles are we going to use? What channels are we going to use? Whether it's going to be internal newsletters, is it going to be your intranet? Is it going to be phone calls? Is it going to be a phone call chain? Externally, is it going to be social media? Is it going to be websites? So how are you going to get that message out there? So it's not just a matter of crafting the message, but how are you going to deliver it? And things that would be very, very helpful to your audiences will certainly be in anticipating what are their questions and having answers already to go to answer those questions. In your plan, you definitely want to have a list of the key media contacts. As David mentioned, it's not just the national guys, it's a lot of the local ones, and you want to know who in your area is going to be covering your industry. Already have their contact information in there so that you can communicate with them very, very quickly. And then you're going to want to look at, well, what are the channels that you control? What are the vehicles that you can get that message out there? And in some cases, you're going to put that message out in multiple channels. So if you're going to put out a news release, you post a news release to your website, and then you can create social media posts that direct people back to that media statement. And then, as we discussed earlier, stakeholder mapping is crucial, where we actually figure out, who are the audiences that we're trying to reach? What do we want to tell them? But also, what's their value to the organization? What kind of impact would they have on our ability to continue operating as a business? So those are the steps of the plan, and I'll turn it back to Norris.
So the mistake I made when I was doing the marketing for Maurice Piers, when the fire broke out, was to start writing a press release. And the first thing I should have done, when you have a fire breaking out and you know the media is going to be coming, the broadcast channels are going to be arriving with their trucks and wanting to set up their cameras, you should have the media on speed dial to say, hey, this is where you want to park and this is where you want to come to get our briefing. And so what I had was people coming from all different angles, needing attention and wanting the story. And what I didn't do was to have everybody on the speed dial, and two, have a location for them to come to, and three, basically herd all of the cats into one place so that we could create a holding platform. So now we're going to give you some some commandments, some rules to follow with regards to handling media interviews. You heard David tell you, think like a journalist. David is a former journalist. And whenever you're getting ready for a media interview, you need to be empathetic, sympathetic with the journalist. The first thing you want to do if you're going to an interview for whatever, you should be pre-briefed by somebody on who you're talking to. You need to know the kinds of stories this writer has written before. You need to know the outlet. You need to know, number two, what you're going to be saying. Every word that comes out of your mouth should be prepared. When I was thrust in front of a national press conference for a presidential candidate who had just announced, and I had no preparation. At least I had a basic training to have 3 points organized in my head. So I don't remember what I said, but I had 3 points, and that carried me through. But you need to have, they're going to be asking you, why did this happen? They're going to be asking you, how did this happen? What happened? When did it happen? Where? The basic questions that are going to be asked. You need to be prepared to come with everything that comes out of your mouth, something that you want to come out of your mouth. Everything is on the record, even when you're not. So some people would say you never go off the record. And some people would say, well, if you really, really trust the journalist, you can go off the record. And sometimes there's a reason, a justification for that. But even when you're going off the record, you should be prepared for whatever you said off the record to come out. There's the whole issue of being prepared for all the questions. That's the hardest and most fearful thing of doing an interview, is especially on camera. What are the questions that they're going to ask, and am I going to be looking stupid, looking foolish, or saying something that I shouldn't? And so you go into an interview, and this helps take all the fear away, all of the anxiety and stress relating to an interview, knowing that you are only going to answer the questions that you're prepared to answer. You're not going to answer anything that you're not prepared to answer. So you have a strategy for the questions that you're prepared to answer. They're coming, you're ready to answer them. You also have a strategy and this is what we call bridging. You have a strategy for being prepared for the ones that you're not going to answer. I don't know that, but what I do know is, and going back right to your main point, you're also prepared not to answer now. That's a good question. I'm going to have someone get back to you with the full information that you need on that. Not prepared to answer now. You're going to be prepared not to answer now. And finally, and this is the hardest one, you're going to be prepared for the ones that you're not prepared not to answer. So for all of those occasions, you have a strategy that takes the fear out of doing the interviews. You listen to each question. and acknowledge each question. Don't ignore any question. You're talking to a human being. They ask a question, and you can say, I understand, I hear you, but maybe we need to step back and look at this from a larger perspective. So you've acknowledged the question, but you've said, you know, really we need to, and you're bridging to a larger perspective that you're more comfortable discussing. Whenever you talk, whenever you do, especially when you get in front of a camera, the first thing that comes out of your mouth in answer to a question should be a headline. If someone asks you how you're doing today, and you say it's okay, they're not really going to ask you any more questions. But if someone asks you how you're doing and you say, I've just had the best day of my entire life. Now that's a headline. And that's going to make your friend, whoever's listening to you, say, well, tell me more about that. Recognize that journalists don't just trust everything that we say, so we have to be prepared to prove it. So when you make a claim, you have to be knowing that, say, well, prove that to me. And then you're armed with the facts, maybe 3 sets of facts that can back up what it is that you're saying. Again, no winning through spinning. Always build a bridge back to your story. And then when you see them writing down what you've said, so it's perfectly okay to say, hey, would you mind reading that back to make sure we got it right? I want to make sure you got it right. Okay, you can invite them to repeat it back to you to make sure that, or in another way, if you felt like you stated it wrong, you say, wait a minute, I'd like to restate that. I want to make sure we get this right. So all of you are going to have an opportunity, if you're in communications, at some point to write a statement. And we wanted to give you a few pointers on how to write a good crisis statement. Dave?
Now, we talked about having a statement and having it ready quickly, but what does it say? Well, the first thing it has to say is what happened, but you also have to say what it means to you. If someone is injured, or God forbid, a fatality as part of their workday, and it's part of your organization, obviously that has to come first. You can't duck it. You can't put it to a lower paragraph. You have to be able to say that this incident is the worst that has ever happened to us. It has shaken the company. We're upset. We're working with the families and coworkers to try to provide counseling, and more important, to do an investigation to make sure that this event never happens again. Then you can explain, earlier today, a malfunction in the mechanical process, whatever it might be. But that first, the lead of that statement has to be able to say, not just taking ownership, but express either sympathy, what's being done about it, and express the tragedy perhaps that's in place. Now, hopefully that would be a really extreme case. But at the same time, you have to describe the incident and show the empathy for people who have been at least inconvenienced, if not much worse. Then later, after you explain what happened, you have to acknowledge, and hopefully this is also in place quickly, that you're working with authorities on investigating what happened. You're sharing information, you're cooperating with others' investigations. And then finally, also saying, here's what we're doing. In the early stages, you won't know a lot of particulars, but you'll know some. And if it's just a mobilization, if it's just working on accountabilities to make sure you've got all of your employees accounted for, all those things are calls to action, which you can say, here's what we're doing about it right now. And if you can, here's what our next steps will be.
So real quickly, and we're gonna end with this one and turn it over for Q&A. We took a trip out to the CDC in I guess Nebraska, and they're some of the best communicators when it comes to being in the middle of a crisis. And they said there are 6 things you need to remember in a crisis. I wanted to share those with you. You want to be first. Why? Because people tend to tune into the channel that is giving the information the quickest. This is why media outlets always want to get the scoop because they know that once you tune in, you're likely to stay. So you want to be the channel that comes out with the information. You want to be right in everything you say because obviously accuracy establishes credibility. And this is so key, expressing empathy. I can't tell you how many communicators have lost connection with their audience by just not being empathetic. Promoting action, people want to know what they can do in a crisis. So giving people meaningful things calms anxiety, it helps to restore order. And then finally showing respect for people and recognizing that they feel vulnerable, and it also encourages cooperation. For those of you that are going to get the, you're all going to get the link to this. We've boiled all the great ideas we've presented today down into 10 more commandments for crisis communications. But while we hold that up on the screen, I'm going to invite folks to go ahead and send some questions in by chat, and we'll do our best to answer them. And if we can't answer them, we'll get back to you offline with your questions. So I'm looking at the chat, and I see, I think I'm seeing Annie and Meredith. If anyone else is sending a question, if Meredith, if you see a question that I don't see, go ahead and read it out to us. Don't be shy.
Norris, I don't see any questions at this point, but if anybody has them, they can submit them in the chat, or we could even have people kind of raise their hands and call on them with questions.
Yep. Everyone's being polite and doesn't want to go first. So while you're thinking of the questions, I'm just going to summarize the 10 commandments that we have here of crisis communications. Number one is having that team in place before the crisis happens. I think we've made that point. You're going to get all the facts. Details matter: who, what, when, where, and why. You're going to remember the principle: tell it all, tell it fast, and tell the truth. If you made a mistake, own it. I can't tell you, that's one of the biggest temptations of communicators. And I've been in a position where I had to tell major people in government that they really, really should tell the truth and own it. And they didn't always take that advice, and it came back to haunt them. And I could tell you some major stories about that down the road. Apologize again and again and again if you've done something wrong. Do the right thing fast. Rebuild the brand, reinforce brand principles, reward customer loyalty. So everything that you do is an extension of your brand. And you start every statement saying, you know, we here at XYZ Insurance Company are dedicated to making sure our customers have a friend in times of crisis. That's who we are. So here's what we're going to do in this crisis. So you've stated the brand stake in the ground at the beginning of every crisis statement, which tells people why you're doing what you're doing. And then you proceed to tell people how you're going to go about dealing with it. Know the battlefield, right? It's the internet. It's greater challenges than ever before. It used to be so much easier than it is now because there are far less media channels. Now we've got hundreds and hundreds of media outlets. Nobody gets all their news from one place. It's become very fragmented, and the internet is just a leaking springboard of information coming from all directions. Don't feed the trolls, but do feed the beast, which is the media. And then finally, for all you attorneys that are on the call today, we want to talk to you, but sparingly, if you don't mind, because we know that you'll keep us out of jail.
Norris, is it always a good idea to have the CEO be the spokesperson? Is it? I mean, a lot of companies you see that, but I mean, is it really important for that person to be the one out there talking in the media?
All right, Rick, that sounds like you. So I'm going to, before I answer that, I've had some questions come up here. And let me read some of those. We've got one question, advice for dealing with employees and rumors about employees. And then there's one question, is it acceptable in a situation to refer any questions to a communications contact if that person is not present? Is it acceptable when in a situation to I'm assuming this is you're being interviewed. Let's say you're doing a press conference. Is it acceptable when in a situation to refer any questions to a communications contact if that person is not present? And then I'm going to read the third one, and I'll let some of my teammates take some of these. In an earlier slide, you suggested pulling advertising from social media in the time of a crisis. Can you touch on this? All right, let's take that one first. Rick, you want to handle what it is?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things you want to do is when a crisis occurs, a lot of your messaging really needs to almost come to a stop. The last thing you want to do is promoting a new product, a new launch, talking about what you're doing over here, over there. It distracts from the issue at hand. It makes you look disingenuous. So you really need to be able to have your pulse on, what's going on out through social media, what's going out through your marketing channels. Do you have any paid advertising going on out there? So you may need to rein all of it in and just put a hold on it until this crisis starts to level off.
Okay, so we have a question. This is the advice for dealing with employees and rumors. And then it was clarified, for instance, employees sharing info on social media. So I guess this would be one employee sharing rumors about another employee on social media. And I'm assuming that these are embarrassing or negative rumors that are being shared. David, would you like to take that one?
Sure. First of all, employees can be your biggest asset in a crisis because hopefully they are well trained and hopefully they've been part of the whole direction of the company in essentially, accountable for its success. So don't write them off. There are cases where you have employees that might be disgruntled or might maybe not even with any poor intentions in mind, but they take to social media and maybe even disclose things that should be confidential. So you don't want to get into a back and forth in social media. Some of those conversations can and should be brought offline, but still addressed individually or maybe within a small group. I would also say, in the same vein, that it's important that you not try to muzzle employees. Some companies say employees may not speak to media. That can result in a side issue on its own that's completely avoidable. What you want to be able to say is we don't put employees in a position where they're forced or coerced or feel obligated to speak with media, because we have people who are designated to do that instead, and employees should feel free to refer any press to those designated spokespeople. But you can't stop people from talking on their own time, on their own platforms. What you can do is to make sure that whatever they're doing is not disrespectful to other employees, and that they don't breach confidentiality, and that they don't attack someone who is not in a position perhaps to or responsibility to engage in that discussion. You have to be careful that employees don't take to social media with anything, personal grudges, for example. That has no place either at the workplace or on social media where they're identifying themselves as your employee.
David, as a follow-up to that, another person is asking if there is an incident, or excuse me, if there's an accident and press gets there first before the firm leadership, is it okay for field staff to defer to a communications representative? Not say no comment, just we cannot answer for the firm. So play that out. How would you?
I think where you have media at the gate, I think that site manager has to be able and authorized to speak for the company, even if it's in a limited way. At that point, even the site manager won't know perhaps everything that led up to an accident, but it's on your property. You have people at the gate, and there's people who are going to be leaving for lunch or leaving at the end of their shift who are going to be able to say, oh yeah, that was terrible. So don't leave that to chance. Make sure that the plant manager or whoever is a senior person at an individual location and a backup are both authorized and trained to be able to respond to media at the scene. By the time someone in headquarters gets back to them, that story will be on the air.
I wanted to follow up on what you were saying about employees as well, because, you know, it really comes down to trust. Are you informing your employees and giving the information they need to understand the specifics of this particular situation? And are you delivering it in a timely basis? And are you delivering it, you know, in a way that people will understand it? And is it coming from somebody that they trust? The last thing you want employees to have, the last thing you want to happen is that employees are getting their news from external sources. You don't want them to hear it from their vendors. You don't want them to hear it from the media. They don't want to learn about massive job layoffs. They don't want to hear about something, a product recall or something. You need to be proactive about it. You need to be thinking about that. And you already have these things in your plan as to how you would address certain situations, what a typical type of message might be if this situation were to arise, and who would deliver it. And that way, again, when the situation occurs, you're able to respond very quickly and not wait until your employees find out about it from the media.
Remember also that whatever you tell employees is public information. You may intend it for only your employees, but once it's on an email, or once it's posted on an intranet, or once there's even a typed memo circulating in a hard copy, it's public information. So be sure that your public statements are consistent with what you tell employees.
And something as simple as an FAQ sometimes could be enough to kind of at least alleviate some of that, you know, doubt. The last thing you want people to feel is that nobody around here tells me anything.
So the best rule of thumb for employees when dealing with the media is to say, we want you to help the media get what they need by directing them to the company spokespeople to get the full story. It's not their job to avoid them and try not to do anything and say no comment. Rather than say, don't talk to the media, say, help the media get to our company spokespeople. The key word is help them. Cooperate, help them do their job, and that will put you in a much better position. So it is 11:31. I think we have a permission to go on a little bit longer since let's see if there's any other questions that came in. We talked about advertising related to site incidents.
Well, follow up on what you were just saying about the no comment. One of the challenges or problems you have if you say no comment is that you kind of have this, people have this perception that you are guilty, that, you know, whatever the issue is, you say no comment, you're hiding something, you know, you're, you know, lying. So you want to avoid that at all costs.
Okay, so Meredith, I think that we've done everything right on time, and we're going to turn it back over to you to bring it to a closure. And we're going to be, any questions that we get offline, we're going to be happy to answer and keep the conversation going. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to be with us today and to listen to what we think is going to be really helpful as you think about crisis communications and being prepared for a crisis in your organization. So I want to also thank the Chamber for giving us this platform to help you as well. Meredith?
Thank you, Norris. I also want to thank everybody for joining us today and the three of you for presenting on such an important and timely topic. Like I mentioned earlier, we will be sending an email out that will include the recording of this webinar, as well as contact information for our panelists. So if you do have additional questions that you would like to discuss with them, you will have the opportunity to do that. We also will be sending a survey to seek some feedback from all of you to help us shape our future programs. And the recording of this webinar will also be available on our website. So with that, I would like to wish everybody a great weekend and to be well. And if you need anything from the Chamber, please feel free to reach out to us. Thank you all for being here today.